Look, I keep coming back to the number. 53 days. That's how long it's been since anyone last saw Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, living quietly in the Catalina Foothills outside Tucson. A place where the nights are still, where people tend to know their routines, and where nothing about her life suggested she would just disappear. Not like this. And before we get too deep into it, I'm curious. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your location in the comments. I always find it grounding to see how far these stories travel, how many people are paying attention from completely different corners of the world. Anyway, back to Nancy. She had a heart condition. She needed daily medication, the kind you don't skip, not casually, not accidentally. On February 1st, sometime in the early morning hours, she was taken from her home, not wandered off, not misplaced, taken. 53 days since her pacemaker stopped signaling. 53 days since blood was found on her front porch. And here's the part that sticks with me: 53 days of carefully worded press conferences. The kind where officials speak a lot but somehow say very little. You start to notice the gaps more than the statements, the pauses, the things they don't confirm. It's like everyone is orbiting around the same conclusion, but no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. Until someone did. But before we get there, there's something we need to be clear about. Everything in this story comes from publicly reported information, statements from law enforcement, and analysis from people who have actually worked cases like this. No one has been charged. No one has been officially accused. What we're doing here is following the evidence, and sometimes that leads to uncomfortable places. Now, if you're into breakdowns like this, slow, detailed, trying to make sense of what doesn't quite add up, go ahead and like the video and subscribe. It helps more than you think, and it keeps this kind of storytelling going. All right. So to understand why this case feels off, you need to understand one name: Rick Castigar. This isn't some outside commentator or a retired analyst looking in from a distance. Castigar spent 46 years inside the Pima County Sheriff's Department, 4.5 decades. That's not just experience, that's institutional memory. He rose to become undersheriff, second in command. And here where it gets interesting. For 37 of those years, the man currently running this investigation, Chris Nanos, worked under him. Not alongside him, under him. So when Castigar talks about how this case has been handled, he's not guessing. He's talking about a system he helped build and a leader he knows very well. On day 51 of the investigation, he sat down with journalist Brian Tin. And what came out of that conversation? It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it carried weight. Because he didn't just offer a theory about Nancy. He pointed to what he believes went wrong from the very beginning. And here's the thing, it starts in those first hours. The window that, in cases like this, matters more than almost anything else. According to Castigar, the case was initially treated as if Nancy had simply walked away. An elderly woman, possibly confused, possibly disoriented, wandering off into the desert night. So what do you do with that assumption? You launch search and rescue. Helicopters, ground teams, horses, people scanning the terrain looking for someone who might be lost but alive. It's a completely different mindset. You're searching for movement, for signals, for signs of life. And for about 18 to 24 hours, that's exactly what happened. Then they found nothing. And I keep thinking about that moment, when nothing turns into something. Because according to Castigar, the evidence that came and should have shifted everything almost immediately. Blood on the porch. A doorbell camera that had been tampered with by someone wearing multiple gloves. Not just one pair, multiple. That's not panic, that's preparation. A person moving in a way that suggested they were actively avoiding other cameras in the area. And maybe most telling of all, Nancy's pacemaker stopped signaling at 2:28 a.m. That's not the profile of someone who wandered off. That's a timeline. That's structure. That's intent. I'm still trying to wrap my head around how you see those details and continue, even briefly, in the mindset of a missing person search. Because the cost of that framing, it's not abstract. If you think someone walked away, you don't immediately lock down the scene as a potential abduction. You don't treat the house like the center of a crime that's still unfolding. You don't push as hard, as fast, in the direction of a suspect. Time moves differently depending on what you think you're dealing with. And in those first 24 hours, time is everything. Castigar didn't mince words. To him, this wasn't just a misstep, it was a critical error. One that may have allowed whoever did this to create distance, to disappear, to get far enough ahead that catching up becomes exponentially harder. Because here's what the evidence was already suggesting, even then. This wasn't random. This wasn't opportunistic. This was organized. The kind of operation where someone had already studied the house, understood the layout, knew when to move and how to move without drawing attention. Someone who came prepared, not just physically, but mentally. And when you look at it that way, the idea of Nancy Guthrie simply wandering off starts to feel less like a theory and more like a delay. A delay in recognizing what was actually happening. A delay that might have changed everything. And that's where this story starts to shift from what happened to how it was handled. Because once you start asking those questions, you can't really stop. And the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to ignore what some of the people closest to this investigation are now saying out loud. Here's the thing about investigations. Officially, they move in careful steps. Unofficially, the people who have done this long enough, they start forming conclusions much earlier than they're willing to say out loud. And in this case, by the time we get to day 47, day 51, you start hearing a different language. Not from press conferences, but from people who have spent years inside rooms where cases either come together or quietly fall apart. One of those voices is Morgan Wright. He's not guessing. He's worked cases where the outcome was never announced in a neat, public way. Cases where investigators had to shift gears internally long before the public caught up. And when he sat down to talk about Nancy Guthrie, he didn't hedge. At some point, he said, you have to realize, this is no longer a missing person case. And I remember pausing on that, because that's not emotional language, it's procedural. It's what you say when the framework itself has changed. If you're looking for a missing person, your entire mindset is built around the idea that they're alive. You're scanning for movement, for footprints, for anything that suggests survival. Even the landscape looks different. You're searching it like it might give someone back to you. But when that classification shifts, when investigators start thinking in terms of what's called a no-body homicide, everything changes. You're not looking for a person anymore. You're looking for absence, disturbance, something that doesn't belong. Wright explained it in a way that's hard to shake. If you're walking through the Catalina Foothills or out into the Sonoran Desert, you're no longer scanning the horizon. You're looking down. You're studying the ground, soil that's been moved, areas that don't quite match their surroundings. Clandestine grave sites. Open ones, concealed ones. And I know that's a heavy turn, but that's exactly his point. You don't use that language unless you believe the case has already crossed a line. What's interesting is how that lines up with what Rick Castigar said just a few days later. Because Castigar didn't just criticize how the investigation started, he went further. He offered his own theory about what actually happened to Nancy. And he was direct. He believes she's passed. Not missing, not being held somewhere, not waiting for a rescue that hasn't come yet. Passed. Now pause there for a second. This is a man who spent 46 years in the same department now working this case. A man who supervised the current sheriff for decades. He understands how these investigations unfold behind closed doors. So when he says that, it's not a guess thrown into the air. It's an interpretation of the evidence, combined with what isn't happening. Because one of the biggest absences in this case is communication. No credible ransom demand. No proof of life. No sustained contact. And that brings us to another voice, Harry Trombitas. He approached it from a different angle, less about the scene itself and more about patterns. What usually happens in cases like this and what doesn't. Kidnappings for ransom, he pointed out, have become increasingly rare in the United States. Not impossible, but risky in ways they didn't used to be. Too many digital trails. Too many ways for a simple demand to turn into a map leading straight back to the person making it. And in Nancy's case, if ransom was the goal, there was a window. The family made it clear they would pay. Law enforcement set up channels for communication. The reward climbed, over $1 million. Everything you would need, if your goal was money, was there. And yet, nothing meaningful came through. There were messages, sure. Some circulated in the media, but they led nowhere. One even resulted in an arrest, a man sending fraudulent ransom texts completely unconnected to the case itself. Which leaves a gap. If it wasn't ransom, then what was the point? Trombitas laid out a few possibilities: revenge, anger, or, and this is where it gets harder to define, a third purpose, something outside the usual categories investigators reach for. And I keep circling back to that, because when experienced people start saying, we might not even be looking at the right kind of motive, it tells you how unusual this is. Now, layer that with something Sheriff Chris Nano said early on, something that didn't get nearly as much attention as it should have. He said investigators believe Nancy was targeted. Targeted. Not random, not a burglary gone wrong, not someone in the wrong place at the wrong time. Targeted suggests intention, selection, a reason. And then, almost in the same breath, he said they believe they know why. But they can't say. That's the part that lingers, because withholding a motive can be strategic, sure. You don't want to compromise an investigation. You don't want to tip off a suspect. But after 53 days, that silence starts to feel different. It starts to feel like a theory that hasn't fully come together, or one that can't yet be proven in a way that holds up. And while all of this is unfolding, these expert opinions, these quiet shifts in language, you have the family. And the family, they're speaking in a way that doesn't always make headlines, but tells you everything about where they are emotionally. Nancy's daughter, Savannah Guthrie, made a video less than a month after the disappearance. And if you listen closely, there's a kind of acceptance threaded through it. Not certainty, not surrender, but the acknowledgement of a possibility. She said her mother may already be gone. Not as a conclusion, more like something she's preparing herself to face. And then, more recently, the family released a statement. And this is where the language shifts again. They didn't ask for her return in the way you might expect. They said they need to know where she is. They talked about bringing her to her final place of rest. That phrase, it's quiet, but it carries weight, because it tells you that, at least in part, they're no longer waiting for a rescue. They're waiting for an answer. And when you put all of this together, the lack of ransom communication, the targeted nature of the abduction, the expert opinions shifting toward a different classification, it starts to form a pattern. Not a confirmed conclusion, but a direction. A sense that whatever plan was set in motion that night didn't unfold the way it was supposed to. That something changed. Something went wrong. And once that happened, the situation may have become impossible to reverse. Which brings us to the part of the story that feels the most specific, the most grounded in physical reality. Because theories can shift, motives can stay hidden. But the evidence on that porch, that doesn't move. And when you look closely at it, really look, you start to see the outline of a moment that changed everything. I keep thinking about the gate. Not in an abstract way, but literally. The physical object. Heavy, reinforced, the kind of security gate you install because you don't want surprises at your front door. The kind that buys you time, distance, a layer between you and whoever's outside. Nancy Guthrie had one of those. It wasn't broken. It wasn't forced open. It was opened. And that detail, it sounds small at first, almost procedural, but the more you sit with it, the more it starts to shape everything else. Because an 84-year-old woman living alone with a heart condition doesn't just open a secured gate at 2 in the morning without a reason. So what was the reason? Look, there are only a few possibilities, and none of them are comfortable. Someone knocked, someone called out, someone said something that made her feel like she needed to respond. Maybe it was concern, someone pretending there was a problem. Maybe it was familiarity, a voice, a name. Something that didn't immediately trigger alarm. Because if it had felt like a threat, she doesn't open that gate. She calls someone, a neighbor, family, 911. But she didn't. She walked toward the door. And whatever happened next happened outside. Her blood was found on the porch. That means the moment things turned, it wasn't deep inside the house. It was right there, just beyond that threshold, the point where safety ends and exposure begins. Now layer that with the timeline. The doorbell camera was disabled at 1:47 a.m., not smashed, not ripped out, disabled. Intentionally. And again, whoever did that was wearing multiple gloves. That's not improvisation. That's planning for evidence, for fingerprints, for trace. Then at 2:28 a.m., her pacemaker stops signaling. That gives you roughly 40 minutes. 40 minutes inside that space, between entry and disappearance. And I don't know about you, but 40 minutes doesn't feel like a quick, clean operation. It feels like time for things to shift, for a plan to start bending under pressure. I'm still trying to wrap my head around what fills those minutes. Was the plan always to take her quickly and leave? Or did something happen, something unexpected that slowed everything down? Because 40 minutes suggests interaction, movement, decisions being made in real time. And here, where the theories from earlier start to converge. A targeted abduction. That's the phrase both investigators and analysts keep circling back to. Not random, not chaotic, intentional, which means whoever showed up that night had a goal in mind before they ever stepped onto that property. Maybe it was leverage. Maybe it was something personal. Maybe it was something we still don't have a category for. But here's the part that keeps surfacing. If the plan relied on a certain level of control, of predictability, then what happens when that control slips? Imagine this scenario, not as speculation, but as a reconstruction based on what we know. The door opens. There's an attempt to move her, to get her compliant, to execute whatever the plan was. But something doesn't go according to script. Maybe she resists. Maybe she recognizes someone. Maybe she says something that changes the stakes entirely. Because recognition, that's the one variable you can't undo. If Nancy Guthrie recognized the person at her door, if she saw a face or heard a voice she could later identify, then the entire operation changes in that instant. It's no longer just about taking her. It's about what happens if she's ever able to speak about it. And once you cross that line, there's no clean way back. That's the part no one says directly, but it's there, underneath everything. In the language experts are using, in the way the case is being reframed. Because if the original goal became unreachable, if something went wrong, if time ran out, if her medical condition became a factor, then the situation shifts from controlled to unstable. and unstable situations force decisions. That's exactly what Rick Castigar was getting at when he said the perpetrators may have had nothing left to bargain with. Because whatever leverage they thought they had, if it disappeared, then so did any reason to keep the situation going in its original form. And that aligns, uncomfortably well, with what Wright said about reclassifying the case. You don't start talking about grave sites unless you believe the outcome has already shifted. Even Harry Trombitas, coming at it from a completely different angle, landed in a similar place. Not ransom, not a clean transactional motive, something more complicated, something that doesn't resolve neatly. And then there's the family. Because while all of this analysis is happening, while experts are debating frameworks and investigators are choosing their words, the family is living in the space between not knowing and maybe knowing more than they want to admit. Savannah Guthrie said it in a way that doesn't sound like analysis at all. It sounds like someone preparing for an outcome they can't confirm, but can't ignore either. She talked about her mother possibly already being gone. And the family's most recent statement, it didn't ask for rescue. It asked for location, for closure, for a place. A final place of rest. That phrase doesn't come easily. It's not the first thing you say when someone disappears. It's what you say when hope has started to change shape. So this is where we are. 53 days in. No confirmed suspect. No clear motive released. No communication that leads anywhere real. And a growing number of voices, experienced, credible, quietly aligning around the same conclusion, even if they phrase it differently. The plan didn't go as intended. Something happened in that 40-minute window. And whatever happened set the rest of this in motion. If you've been following this with me, if you've been trying to piece it together the same way, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Not because it changes the case, but because it keeps conversations like this alive, and sometimes that's how pressure builds in the right places. Because here's the part I can't shake. If Nancy Guthrie opened that door for a reason, if she responded to something that felt familiar or urgent, then that moment wasn't random. It was specific, personal even. Which means somewhere out there is someone who knows exactly what was said at that door. And maybe the better question isn't just what happened after it opened, but why did she open it at all?